Have you ever felt like the ground beneath your life is crumbling piece by piece? Like no matter how hard you try to live with honesty and purpose, something invisible, heavy, and unexplainable begins to strip away the very things you love most. Without warning, without mercy. Imagine opening your eyes one morning, only to find that before the sun even climbs halfway through the sky, everything you hold dear is gone. Your family, your livelihood, your health, your inner peace. All lost, as if pulled from your hands by a force you can't see, and a silence from above that you can't break. What would you do if your world collapsed and heaven said nothing? There exists an ancient story, so profound, so unsettling, that it has echoed through generations for thousands of years. Many claim to know it. Fewer have truly grasped its weight. It is not folklore. It is not symbolic myth. It is the cry of a soul laid bare, a heart stripped to its core. And what's more, it holds a truth that most voices in pulpit still hesitate to say aloud, a truth buried beneath suffering, a revelation forged in the fire of pain, a secret that challenges the very foundation of what we think we know about God, about faith, and about ourselves. Have you ever heard of Job? If his story has ever stirred something within you, don't let this moment pass. Share your thoughts. Have you ever gone through something that tested your faith, stripped your soul, and left you asking, why me? Leave a comment. And if this message touches your spirit, don't forget to subscribe, tap the bell, like this video, and send it to someone who's walking through a dark valley right now. Because this journey, what you're living right now, might not be a punishment. It might be the beginning of something deeper, a faith not built on answers, but on presence. What if the pain you thought was a curse was actually a calling? What if everything you've lost was making space for something eternal? In this video, we will not simply tell you who Job was. We will uncover why his life still unsettles the comfortable, convicts the proud, and awakens those who have learned to survive more than live. You don't need to be religious to understand this. You only need to know what it feels like to love something and to lose it. Because sometimes it's not the blessing that draws us closer to the divine, it's the breaking. So stay with us until the end. What you're about to hear may shift the way you see every tear, every silence, and every scar you carry. This is not a tale of the past. It is a revelation for the present. Before everything fell apart, there was a man. He lived far from the noise of the cities, surrounded by gentle hills and vast skies. His land was generous, his reputation flawless. People spoke his name with respect, because his life carried a quiet, unseen favor, the kind that opened paths where others met walls. His name was Job. On the surface, he was successful, but what truly set him apart wasn't his wealth, it was his heart. People admired him not just for his livestock or property, but for how he treated others. He was fair, compassionate, faithful, and he honored God not for appearances, but in private, when no one else was watching. Job had a large family, 10 children who loved one another dearly. They gathered often, celebrated and laughed. Their meals weren't luxurious, but rich in joy and unity. Every day felt like a gift, and Job never took that for granted. Each time his children shared a feast, Job would rise early the next morning to pray for them. He didn't suspect wrongdoing. His father's heart simply wouldn't rest until he had lifted them before God, just in case. In his community, Job was a pillar. When someone was in need, he was the first to help. He gave without expecting anything in return. People associated his name with integrity. And yes, he was prosperous. His land stretched beyond what the eye could see. His animals thrived in shaded fields. His workers followed him not out of fear, but because he was just. Many envied his life, not for its luxury, but for its harmony. Yet beneath the surface, there was something even greater. Job wasn't flawless, but his heart leaned toward righteousness. He didn't compromise for gain. He didn't trade his conscience for comfort. Though surrounded by abundance, his soul was not attached to any of it. And because of that, without knowing, he was ready for a storm that would have destroyed any other man. Job didn't make decisions based on personal gain. He didn't twist his conscience for comfort or convenience. Though surrounded by prosperity, he was not bound to it. His heart was anchored in something greater, something deeper. And because of that, without knowing it, he was more prepared than most for what was about to come. Strangely, those who have much often stand to lose more, and those with the deepest faith tend to face the fiercest storms. In the quiet rhythm of his daily life, Job had no idea that clouds were gathering. Clouds not of weather, but of destiny. The days flowed in harmony, harvesting, praying, caring, and laughing with loved ones. There were no omens, no whispered warnings in the night, no dreams, no premonitions, just another morning in a life that seemed untouchable. And yet, behind the veil of the visible, something was unfolding. In a realm beyond time and space, a dimension not charted on any map, a council gathered. There were no golden thrones, no jeweled crowns, but each being present had purpose. Among them stood one who carried not reverence, but scrutiny. His eyes searched not for light, but for cracks in the soul. He didn't come to honor, he came to accuse. The Eternal, radiant and unshaken, asked him plainly, "From where do you come?" His reply was devoid of feeling. "From wandering the earth, observing its people." He didn't need to say more. His mission was clear: to identify weakness disguised as strength, devotion rooted not in love, but in convenience. His aim wasn't to comfort, it was to disrupt. And then the question echoed, timeless and unflinching. "Have you considered my servant Job?" There was pride in the Creator's voice. Job was unlike the others, upright, pure, respectful of good and wary of evil, a light in the midst of shadows. But the accuser didn't flinch. "Why wouldn't he honor you? You've surrounded him with blessing. You've protected his house, his health, his legacy. He has everything. Of course he worships you." Then came the challenge. Harsh, precise, almost cruel. "Strip him of all he owns, and you'll see the truth. He'll curse you to your face." It was a direct strike at the heart of faith itself. The Almighty, confident in the integrity of Job, did not retreat. "You may touch all he has, but do not lay a hand on his life." And with that, without Job hearing a whisper of warning, a spiritual war began, one that would not be seen with eyes, but would shake the very foundations of his world. This was not punishment, nor was it the result of hidden sin. Job had done nothing wrong, no deception, no injustice, no violence. His only fault was being a man of complete integrity, and that is why he would be tested. Some trials are not announced. Some wars are fought without weapons. Some of the deepest battles begin when everything appears perfectly still. Meanwhile, on the earth, Job rose with the same calm he always carried. He walked among his flocks, spoke with his servants, smiled at his children, kissed his wife. Nothing seemed different. Nothing felt wrong. But above him, heaven had spoken, and what had been allowed could no longer be undone. This moment raises a question for us all. What holds up our faith? Is it the comfort of our routine, or the presence of the one we cannot see? It's easy to believe when life flows smoothly. It's simple to sing when there's food on the table and our loved ones are safe. But what happens when the ground cracks beneath us? The challenge wasn't born from divine whim. It was a statement. The human heart loves while it receives, but in loss it forgets. Job didn't know any of this. He was unaware of the unseen conversation, the spiritual wager, and yet he would become the center of a trial not meant to destroy, but to uncover what lived in the very depths of his soul. That day began like any other. The sky was clear, the breeze gentle, the fields glowed in morning light. There was no thunder, no dream, no divine whisper in the night. Just Job, rising early, faithful, grateful, unaware. that before sunset his world would never be the same again. That morning, Job followed his familiar routine. He walked the perimeter of his lands, observed the livestock grazing peacefully, greeted his workers with dignity, and paused in quiet gratitude for the life he had. Every breath felt steady, every moment secure. What he didn't know was that with each step, he was drawing closer to a storm that would shatter everything. The first tremor came suddenly. A servant, breathless and dust-covered, rushed toward him. "Master, we were ambushed." He recounted how a band of raiders had attacked the fields. The oxen were stolen, the donkeys taken, and all the laborers slaughtered. He had barely escaped to bring the news. Job stood still. His face didn't contort in panic. He absorbed the shock in silence, perhaps believing it to be an isolated tragedy. Painful, yes, but manageable. He inhaled slowly, gripped by the weight of responsibility, and prepared himself to act. But before he could even respond, another voice pierced the air. "Fire! Fire from the heavens!" It consumed the pasture, the sheep, the herdsmen, everything. "I'm the only one left." Job's breath caught in his throat. Before he could even begin to grasp the scale of loss, a third messenger emerged on the horizon. "3 bands of raiders surrounded us, master. They took the camels, killed everyone with them. I escaped, alone, 3 blows, each like a hammer falling without mercy. No time to mourn, no chance to understand, only devastation compounding with each breath. And yet, it wasn't over. A 4th man approached. He wasn't running. His steps were heavy, his eyes hollow. He said nothing at first. The stillness around him spoke louder than words. When he finally did speak, it was barely above a whisper. "Your children." Job stared, as if hoping to reverse the message before it left the man's lips. "They were gathered at your eldest son's house, celebrating. There was laughter, food, then a violent wind struck from the desert. It collapsed the house. All 4 corners caved in. It fell on them. Silence. None survived. I alone made it out to tell you." Job's knees gave way. He collapsed onto the dirt. His lips did not curse. His eyes did not rage. His soul, however, cracked beneath the weight of grief. In a single day, he had lost everything. His security, his livelihood, his children. What others take a lifetime to build had turned to ash in mere hours. He didn't run, he didn't scream, he didn't lash out. Instead, he stood, slowly, reverently, then tore his robes in mourning and lowered himself to the ground, not in defiance, but in surrender. His voice was faint, trembling beneath the sorrow, but unwavering. "I came into this world with nothing, and I will leave it the same. The Lord gave, and he has taken away. Blessed be his name." On the darkest day of his life, Job chose worship. He had no answers, no understanding of the events that had stripped him bare. Yet he refused to curse. He didn't blame, he didn't demand. He held on to the only thing left untouched, his integrity. The air grew still. The laughter that once filled his home was gone. The fields, once alive with color and movement, now stood quiet as graves. Silence didn't just visit. It made its home there, not as a comfort, but as a weight. Job didn't wail. He didn't cry aloud for justice. But inside, something slow and quiet was unraveling. Like a candle burning from within, his strength diminished in silence. His knees trembled, and his eyes, now dry, stared into a world that no longer made sense. Days passed. No one dared to approach, not out of fear, but out of reverence for the ruin that surrounded him. Then, from distant lands, 3 men arrived. Old companions, friends from better seasons. They had once seen him at the height of influence, and now came to witness his fall. As they drew near, they failed to recognize him. His skin bore the marks of suffering. His face, once bright, was sunken and pale. His posture slouched under the invisible weight of grief. The man they knew was gone. Torn by sorrow, they ripped their garments, not in ritual, but in helplessness. What words could touch wounds this deep without making them worse? So they said nothing. For 7 days and 7 nights they sat beside him. No questions, no advice, just presence, breathing the same dust, sharing the same broken earth. It was the only offering they had, their silent company. It was how they chose to be near without intruding, to remain without trying to fix. Job remained silent, but inside a storm gathered. His thoughts twisted into knots, his emotions swirled like dust in the wind. How does one find clarity when everything around has collapsed? How do you hold on to belief when nothing makes sense anymore? If I've lived with integrity, why do I feel cursed? If I've walked in righteousness, why does darkness cling to me like a thief in the night? Is justice some kind of game, or is there something hidden within me I've never seen? His faith wasn't gone, but it was wounded. He still believed in God, but his ability to understand him had broken under the weight of loss. And then Job finally spoke. His voice was not loud, but every word cut deep like a blade honed by grief. He didn't scream. He didn't blaspheme. He simply poured out his soul with raw honesty. Cursed be the day I was born. I wish I had never opened my eyes to this world. It would have been better not to exist than to live long enough to lose everything. He didn't directly blame God, but grief has a language all its own, and Job's sorrow spoke louder than logic. Desperation doesn't always ask for permission. It doesn't wait for explanations. It just aches. His friends listened, and in their minds, the time had come to speak, but their hearts weren't aligned with his pain. What they offered wasn't comfort. It was conclusion. "You must have done something wrong," one of them suggested. "No one suffers without cause," another insisted. "Maybe God is disciplining you," added the third. Job heard their words, but they didn't bring peace. How could they understand pain they hadn't lived? How could they speak with certainty while untouched by loss? What Job needed wasn't instruction. He didn't need someone to fix him. He needed presence, empathy, silence that held him, not judged him. But instead, he found himself forced to defend his own integrity, not from arrogance, but because no one else would. "I've hidden nothing. I haven't stolen. I've never raised my voice against the innocent. I've never turned away from the poor or the hungry." And yet, disaster had swallowed him whole. That was the mystery he couldn't untangle. His battle was no longer just against grief. It was now against misunderstanding, against the idea that only the wicked suffer, against the assumption that every wound is punishment. And deep within, a new question began to rise. What if God is still good, even when he doesn't look like it? There are moments when faith becomes an open wound. Not because we stop believing, but because what we believe crashes against what we feel. Job was not weak. He was broken, not faithless, but full of unanswered questions. Still, he did not sever his connection to the divine. He didn't walk away from God. He just longed to be heard. His cry wasn't rebellion. It was the voice of someone who still loved, but didn't understand. And that unfiltered grief, that sacred honesty, would become the turning point, not only for Job, but for how we understand faith in the face of suffering. Job's soul was in shreds. His body bore visible wounds, but the internal ones bled quietly and relentlessly. He had gone from a man others revered to an object of pity, or worse, suspicion. Whispers followed his name. Some claimed he must have hidden sins. Others simply avoided saying his name aloud. But the deepest pain didn't come from their judgment. It came from the silence, that hollow, unbearable sense that heaven had shut its gates, that the voice he once heard in prayer no longer reached beyond the wind. Job had built altars. He had lived a life of principle. He had loved God sincerely, and still everything fell apart. Where was justice now? What value was there in righteousness if the innocent suffered like the guilty? One of his friends, with a solemn voice and the illusion of wisdom, began to speak. He approached as though he carried answers, reminded Job that no one is truly without error. that perhaps pain was just the harvest of hidden faults. One of the men finally spoke again, his tone low, as if cloaked in wisdom. He didn't accuse directly, but he implied, perhaps this pain was correction. Maybe suffering in its harshest form was simply divine love disguised as loss. Job listened. He remained still, face composed, but something shifted beneath the surface, not from pride, not from denial, but because his memory stood in direct conflict with their assumptions. He remembered his life. He remembered what he had done, and more importantly, what he had never done. He had never exploited the weak, never shut his door to the poor, never lifted his hand in injustice. "Why do you insist on finding guilt where there is none?" he asked softly but firmly. "Isn't the pain I carry enough? Must I now defend myself against those who came to comfort me?" Another friend jumped in, this time blunt and tactless. He didn't hesitate. "If your children died, they must have done something wrong. God doesn't make mistakes. If they were punished, there must have been a reason." Job's eyes fell to the ground. The pain in his chest was sharper than before. His children, those he had prayed for day after day, those he had offered sacrifices for at dawn, were now being used as theological ammunition. How could they speak so casually, so coldly, about those he loved with his whole heart? "My complaint isn't against God," he said, his voice fragile and trembling. "It's against the silence. I'm trying to make sense of what makes no sense. I ask, and there's no reply. I search, and I find nothing. I don't challenge his greatness. I just don't know where I stand in the midst of it." Still, the speeches continued, one after another, each man presenting his explanation, his interpretation, his conclusion. One said, "Life is a balance. Eventually, everything evens out." Another offered, "God disciplines those he loves. Be thankful, Job. This is mercy in disguise." But each phrase, each theological attempt to frame the suffering only drove the knife deeper. This wasn't the time for formulas. It wasn't the moment for doctrine. This was darkness, raw and unfiltered, and what Job needed wasn't an answer, it was presence. "I have lived uprightly," Job cried out one afternoon. "Has God turned against me? Why does he hide from me? I shout into the wind and there's no reply. I search the north, he's not there. I look to the south, I still don't find him." His words weren't rebellion. They were the honest groans of a soul that still believed, but didn't understand. It was the prayer of someone whose faith was not lost, but shaken by the silence of heaven. Inside him, war raged, between what he knew and what he felt, between what he'd taught and what he now endured. He didn't doubt that God existed, but he questioned his closeness. He didn't challenge his power, but he wrestled with his justice. "If only I could speak with him," he whispered. "If only he would grant me an audience. I would present my case, not with arrogance, not with rage, but with the respect I've always shown him, and he would see that my heart is sincere." But the silence didn't break. In his anguish, Job began to recall every act of goodness, every orphan he had welcomed, every hungry soul he had fed, every unjust situation he had stepped into. He had not allowed greed to corrupt him. Pride had never taken root in his decisions. So why then did his life feel like a cruel joke? The silence of God became the heaviest burden, not because Job denied him, but because he no longer understood him. His faith hadn't crumbled, but it trembled. He felt like a tree in a violent storm, still standing but with limbs torn and scattered. Job felt abandoned, not by men, but by heaven. And yet, something inside him refused to let go. "Though he slay me, still I will hope in him," he whispered under the stars one night. It wasn't a victory cry, it was a confession through tears. Not surrender in defeat, but trust born of desperation. It was a leap into the unknown, with eyes shut tight, hoping that at the bottom an unseen hand would catch him. His friends didn't understand. To them, pain always had a cause, blessing always meant approval. They saw the world as an equation. But Job, Job was learning something deeper, something that couldn't be measured in logic. From the ashes of his life, Job was beginning to understand something deeper, something that had never been written on scrolls or spoken in sermons. True faith isn't proven in the calm, it's revealed in the ruins. It's not measured by how we respond when life rewards us, but by how we endure when life strips us bare. His words changed. They became more intimate, more vivid, more honest. Gone was the composed voice of the wise elder. What now emerged was the voice of a man shattered, but not destroyed. "Everyone avoids me now," he said. "Even my servants turn their faces. The children mock me in the streets. My own breath disgusts my wife. And yet I know there is one who sees beyond what others see, one who knows the truth in my heart." The pain hadn't lifted. The wounds remained open. The silence from above still lingered. But somewhere within the wreckage of his soul, Job clung to something, faint, flickering, yet unextinguished. Hope. It didn't make sense. It had no foundation left, and yet it stood, fragile, scarred, but alive. As the days dragged on, the same faces returned to speak again. The same voices repeated their worn-out theories. Job no longer argued. Sometimes he simply stared at the ground, too exhausted to respond. His friends, with all their years and status, rotated through their roles, advising, rebuking, correcting, insisting he accept guilt that he knew didn't exist. Then something unexpected happened. A fourth voice entered the circle. He was younger than the rest, quiet until now, almost forgotten in the background. He wasn't part of the original three. He hadn't spoken a word until this moment. His name was Elihu, son of Barakel. No one expected him to speak. He lacked age. He lacked reputation. He didn't have the authority others carried, and yet when he opened his mouth, his voice did not waver. "I've waited my turn," he began, "because I was taught to respect the wisdom of the elders. But now, I've learned that age doesn't always bring understanding." The others turned toward him, some frowning, others caught off guard, but Elihu didn't flinch. "You've hurled words at Job like stones," he said. "You've accused without evidence. You've searched for guilt where maybe there is only mystery. And you, Job, you've spent your breath defending yourself, more than you've honored the greatness of God." The tension in the air was thick, but no one interrupted. Elihu's tone carried no arrogance, only conviction, the kind that can't be faked, the kind born from truth. "I've listened patiently," he continued. "I gave space for wisdom to emerge, but instead I found only coldness, harsh words with no compassion, defenses of God that shrink him down to man-made formulas." Then his gaze shifted to Job. "And you, who have suffered more than any of us, you began to demand answers from God as if he owed you. You've claimed your righteousness, and perhaps it's true, but even the purest among us cannot grasp the fullness of his ways. He is beyond comprehension." Job said nothing, but his eyes didn't reject the words. Something in Elihu's voice struck a different chord. It wasn't condemnation. It wasn't hollow comfort. It came from another place, a place not of authority, but of sincerity. Elihu's voice softened. "God doesn't always speak how we expect. Sometimes he speaks in visions, other times through illness, sometimes through silence, not to punish, but to call us back, to refine us, to show us what we'd never see otherwise." His eyes burned with compassion. Not all suffering is a sentence. Not all pain is punishment. Sometimes it's a warning. Sometimes it's teaching. And sometimes it's just one piece of a story too vast for us to understand. The older men lowered their heads. Perhaps they never imagined they'd be challenged by someone younger. But each word Elihu spoke had cracked the walls of their tidy logic. Their rigid certainty had been exposed. "You spoke as if you had God fully figured out," Elihu concluded, "as if every pain could be solved by an equation, as if the Almighty could be boxed into human reasoning. But he is not small. He doesn't need our defense. He seeks hearts that tremble with humility, not lips that echo hollow theories. The Almighty is not someone to be reduced to formulas or defended by human logic. He doesn't need our protection. What he desires are hearts that bow in humility, not mouths full of hollow arguments. Elihu paused for a moment. He looked upward, as if searching the heavens for strength, then exhaled slowly. "Job," he said gently, "you've cried out for justice, and that's understandable. You've asked why, and no one condemns you for it, but there is something beyond our reasoning, something deeper than pain. God is vast. His voice, like thunder, cannot be ignored. He reigns over the skies, the rivers, the winds, and the souls of men. And though we cannot see him, he is always at work." The words didn't stir applause, nor did they meet resistance. They simply settled, like rain falling on dry, broken ground. No one spoke, but something in the air had changed. For the first time, someone spoke not to win a debate, but to awaken hearts. "The Creator isn't a capricious judge," Elihu continued. "He is wise, he is just, but he is also free. If you truly wish to encounter him, Job, it won't come through complaints, it will come through reverence." Job closed his eyes. Elihu's words didn't bring final answers, but they opened a window. A new kind of light crept in, not from pride or guilt, but from a raw honesty that dared to look toward heaven without pretending to understand it. "God is greater than our grief," Elihu said finally. "And if he allows something, no matter how confusing or painful, it isn't because he has turned against us. Sometimes he just wants us to trust, especially when we don't understand." Silence followed. Job didn't reply. Neither did the others. But the room, no, the atmosphere, felt different. Not because the pain was over, but because something new had begun. Perspective. What Elihu planted that afternoon wasn't a solution. It was a seed, one that would ready Job's heart for what was coming next. Because after the storm of human words came a voice unlike any other. Not the voice of a man, but of the one who had been silent all along. And when that voice spoke, it shattered every assumption, every theory, everything that came before had only been the prologue. The heavens, quiet for so long, broke open, not with gentle rain or warm light, but with a roar. A fierce wind tore through the air, shifting the atmosphere with a weight that could not be ignored. Something divine was approaching. Job lifted his head. This wasn't soft comfort, this wasn't logic. This was the presence of the eternal. A whirlwind formed, violent and consuming. And from its core came a voice, not like man's, but like the one who holds the cosmos in his hand. "Who is this that darkens my counsel with words without knowledge?" The voice was steady, unshakable, not condemning, but awakening. "Brace yourself like a warrior. I will question you and you shall answer me." Each image, each question spoken from the whirlwind, unveiled a universe guided by wisdom far beyond human reach. Job didn't interrupt, not because he couldn't, but because he no longer wanted to. His spirit was quiet, not in defeat, but in reverence. Then something even more profound occurred. God described wild, untamable creatures, forces of nature that no human could master. Behemoth, Leviathan, symbols of chaos and power. Yet even they answered to their Creator. It was as if God asked, "If you cannot control or even understand these beings, how can you expect to grasp my ways?" And in that moment, Job understood. He didn't need reasons. He needed presence. He wasn't looking for explanations anymore. He longed for trust. And in the eye of the storm, in the center of divine power, the voice of God didn't resolve every question. But it gave Job something far greater. Peace. Not peace that came from understanding his suffering, but from remembering who was speaking to him. At last, Job saw it clearly, not through argument, not through restitution, but through awareness, through surrender. His faith had once rested on knowledge, on structure, on order, but now, after walking through the valley of silence and loss, he discovered something deeper. "I had only heard of you before," he whispered, "but now my eyes have seen you." It wasn't a physical vision. It was internal, a clarity that rose from the deepest wound. In the ashes, Job awakened. He no longer needed answers, because his soul had been touched by the very presence of the one he had worshipped all his life. That was the secret. Not a reward, not a formula, but transformation. True faith doesn't demand certainty. It learns to rest in the mystery. And Job was never the same. His heart became gentler, his words fewer. He no longer sought to understand everything. He had learned the highest wisdom, that not all things must be known, to trust fully. In that sacred moment, Job stopped defending himself. He asked for nothing. He simply surrendered and found that surrender itself was the beginning of restoration. After the silence came the storm. After the storm came the voice. And after the voice came the change. Job was blessed with more children. His fields flourished again. New opportunities rose from the ground where ashes once lay. But what mattered most was not what could be counted or touched. What he gained was unseen, a deeper faith, a clearer vision, and a more intimate understanding of who God is and who he was before the sacred. Yet perhaps the most astonishing moment came not in the restoration of his possessions, but in the restoration of his heart. Job prayed for the very friends who had wounded him with their words. He lifted up those who had accused him without mercy. He didn't harbor resentment. He didn't return judgment for judgment. Instead, he interceded for them. That prayer, simple yet profound, was the clearest sign that Job's soul had been made whole again. Not just his wealth, but his character had been healed. His life was extended. He lived to see his children's children and walk through the rest of his days with the kind of wisdom only known by those who have walked through fire and survived. He was not the same man who began the journey. He was changed, not bitter, not broken, but softer, stronger, wiser, more grounded in truth than ever before. And his greatest legacy wasn't land, nor livestock, nor riches. It was his story, a testimony passed through generations, proof that genuine faith isn't measured by what you own, but by what you hold on to, even when the heavens are silent. Job taught us that some pain will never make sense, but it will shape us, that not every question needs an answer to be holy, that some losses, though never replaced, give birth to a new version of ourselves, one forged in the fire and filled with quiet strength. His restoration was the natural fruit of an inner transformation. But the true inheritance he left lives in his example, his voice, his endurance. And even now, after all these centuries, we still speak his name, not because of his prosperity, but because of his perseverance. So when everything feels lost, when heaven seems silent, and your soul feels abandoned, remember Job. Maybe what you're living through isn't a punishment. Maybe it's an invitation to see God with new eyes, because the deepest encounters are born from the deepest breaking.